If your surname is on this list, there was a time when powerful members of your bloodline may have been viewed as enemies of the crown. Across centuries of conflict in Ireland, certain family names became closely associated with rebellion, resistance, and defiance. Their chiefs fought wars against English expansion. Their lands were confiscated. Their strongholds were destroyed. Some were driven into exile, while others watched kingdoms their families had ruled for generations disappear. And here's what makes these stories remarkable. Millions of people still carry these surnames today, often with no idea that the same name on their passport once belonged to kings, rebel leaders, outlawed chiefs, and families caught on the losing side of some of the most violent struggles in Irish history. O'Neill, O'Donnell, Fitzgerald, O'Brien. Today, they're ordinary surnames, but centuries ago, powerful people carrying these names could represent something far more dangerous, an Ireland that refused to surrender its old order. We're going through 17 Irish surnames whose histories became tangled with rebellion, confiscation, exile, and resistance to the crown. If your surname appears anywhere on this list, tell me in the comments, and if your family has a story about where in Ireland your ancestors came from, include that too. And stay with me until number 17, because that family became connected to one of the most infamous episodes of violence and betrayal in the history of the Irish plantations. Let's begin. 1. O'Neill. We start with perhaps the most powerful name on this entire list, O'Neill. For centuries, the O'Neills dominated much of Ulster. They weren't simply wealthy landowners. They belonged to one of the great Gaelic dynasties of Ireland, producing rulers whose authority existed long before English power could be firmly imposed across the north. That made the O'Neills enormously important, and eventually enormously dangerous to the expanding English state. By the late 16th century, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, had become the central figure in the 9 Years' War. For years, his forces challenged English armies and came frighteningly close to changing the future of Ireland. But the rebellion ultimately failed. Then, in 1607, came the event remembered as the Flight of the Earls. Hugh O'Neill and other Gaelic nobles left Ireland for continental Europe. They would never return to reclaim their former power. The political world their ancestors had ruled was collapsing behind them, and the Ulster plantation that followed transformed much of the territory once controlled by Gaelic families. But the O'Neill name survived. A dynasty could lose its kingdom. A surname was much harder to erase. 2. O'Donnell, standing beside the O'Neills, were another great dynasty of Ulster, the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, and one man turned this surname into a legend, Red Hugh O'Donnell. After escaping English imprisonment, he emerged as one of the most important Gaelic leaders of his generation and became a major figure in the 9 Years' War. Alongside Hugh O'Neill, he fought to preserve a Gaelic political order increasingly threatened by English expansion. For a time, it looked possible that they might succeed. Then came Kinsale. The defeat of the Irish and Spanish forces there changed everything. Red Hugh traveled to Spain seeking further assistance, but he died there in 1602, far from Donegal. Within only a few years, the old Gaelic leadership of Ulster was collapsing. The O'Donnells lost the political world their family had spent centuries building. Yet more than 400 years later, their surname remains everywhere. The kingdom disappeared. The name didn't. 3. O'Byrne. Not every resistance story unfolded on an open battlefield. Some were fought from the mountains, and few families understood those mountains better than the O'Byrnes of Wicklow. For generations, the difficult terrain south of Dublin allowed Gaelic families such as the O'Byrnes to resist outside control far longer than authorities wanted. The most famous among them was Fiach McHugh O'Byrne. He became a persistent opponent of English authority during the Elizabethan period, using the landscape of Wicklow to his advantage and supporting resistance against the government. To officials in Dublin, he wasn't some distant nuisance. He was a serious problem almost on their doorstep. Eventually, government forces hunted him down, and Fiach was killed in 1597. But by then, the O'Byrne surname had already become deeply connected to the history of resistance in Wicklow. Some families defended castles. The O'Byrnes had mountains. 4. McCarthy travels south into Munster, and another ancient dynasty appears, McCarthy. Long before English rule became dominant across Ireland, branches of the McCarthy family controlled enormous territories in the south. They produced kings and powerful regional lords. But as English authority expanded, that independence became increasingly difficult to maintain. The wars and plantations that transformed Munster shattered much of the old Gaelic political structure. McCarthy territories became entangled in confiscation, shifting alliances, rebellion, and attempts by the Crown to impose a completely different system of control. For families accustomed to ruling their own lands, the change was devastating. Within generations, power that had taken centuries to build could disappear. But once again, the surname outlived the political world surrounding it. Fitzgerald. The Fitzgeralds are different from almost every family we've mentioned so far. Because their ancestors didn't begin as Gaelic Irish rulers, they came from the Anglo-Norman world. Over generations, however, powerful Fitzgerald branches became deeply rooted in Ireland, adopting local customs and building enormous power of their own. And eventually, some Fitzgeralds became a threat to the same crown from which their original authority had come. In 1534, Thomas Fitzgerald, Silken Thomas, rebelled against Henry VIII. The rebellion failed. Silken Thomas and 5 of his uncles were eventually executed, but that wasn't the end of Fitzgerald rebellion. Later in the century, the Desmond rebellions brought another branch of the dynasty into devastating conflict with the crown. By the time those wars ended, huge areas of Munster had been transformed. The Fitzgerald story carries a strange historical irony. A family that rose within the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland eventually produced men treated as rebels against English rule. Yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's enemy. 6. O'Sullivan. Now we come to one of the most haunting survival stories on this list. O'Sullivan, following the defeat at Kinsale, the position of Donald Cam O'Sullivan Bear became increasingly desperate. His stronghold at Dunboy was attacked and destroyed. But the story didn't end there. In the winter of 1602 to 1603, O'Sullivan Bear and a large group of followers began an extraordinary journey from the southwest of Ireland toward the north. They crossed hundreds of miles during winter while facing hunger, exhaustion, hostile territory, and constant danger. Many who began the journey never reached its end. It became one of the most famous marches in Irish history. The O'Sullivans had lost strongholds and political power, but descendants carrying their name would eventually spread far beyond Ireland. Sometimes survival doesn't mean keeping your kingdom. Sometimes it simply means making sure someone is left to carry the name. 7. Burke. The Burkes tell another complicated story. Their ancestors were the Anglo-Norman de Burghs, one of the most powerful families to establish themselves in Ireland after the Norman arrival. But over generations, branches of the family became increasingly integrated into Gaelic Ireland. They adopted local customs, formed alliances with Gaelic families, and developed identities increasingly independent from England. In Connaught, Burke power became enormous, but that independence repeatedly brought different branches of the family into conflict, with rivals, with each other, and with the expanding authority of the crown. The Burkes demonstrate something important about Irish history. The conflict was never simply Irish surnames against English surnames. After centuries in Ireland, the lines had become far more complicated. A family could arrive with conquest, and generations later fight against the government trying to control the same country. 8. O'Brien. Few Irish surnames carry a royal association as famous as O'Brien. The name traces its dynastic identity to the descendants of Brian Boru, the celebrated High King who died after the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. For centuries afterward, branches of the O'Brien dynasty remained major powers, particularly in Thomond. But survival sometimes required compromise rather than permanent rebellion. Some O'Brien leaders negotiated with the crown, others resisted. Different branches made different choices at different moments, and that is exactly why this surname matters. Irish history wasn't divided neatly between families who fought and families who surrendered. Powerful dynasties constantly had to decide whether resistance, negotiation, or adaptation offered the best chance of survival. The O'Briens survived that changing world. Their ancient kingdom did not survive in the same form. Their surname did. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Have you recognized your surname yet? Or one belonging to your parents or grandparents? And if you haven't, keep watching. Some of the most dramatic family stories are still ahead. 9. Kavanagh. The Kavanaghs carried something especially dangerous in medieval Ireland, a claim to kingship. They descended from the McMurrough Kavanagh dynasty of Leinster, and for generations members of the family continued asserting power in a region English authorities wanted firmly controlled. One of their most famous leaders, Art McMurrough Kavanagh, became such a formidable opponent that English kings themselves had to confront the problem he represented. Despite repeated campaigns, the family's influence proved remarkably difficult to eliminate. But over the centuries, the old Gaelic and Gaelicized lordships were gradually weakened. Territory disappeared. Political independence disappeared. The world in which the Kavanaghs could behave like kings disappeared. Yet their surname still carries the memory of that claim. 10. O'Reilly. In the old kingdom of East Breifne, the O'Reilly dynasty held power for centuries. Today, O'Reilly is familiar around the world, but in medieval and early modern Ireland, it belonged to a ruling family. Their territory centered largely on what is now County Kavanagh. And like the other Gaelic lordships of Ulster and the borderlands, their political independence eventually collided with an expanding English state. By the early 17th century, the transformation of Ulster and the plantation system had fundamentally altered the old order. Land ownership changed, political authority changed. Families that had once ruled territory under Gaelic systems now found themselves living in a completely different Ireland. The O'Reilly surname survived that transformation, eventually traveling with Irish migration across Britain, America, Australia, and far beyond. 11. O'Toole. The O'Tooles, like the O'Byrnes, became closely associated with the rugged country around Wicklow. Their location mattered. Those mountains and valleys provided refuge close to Dublin, but difficult for outside authorities to completely dominate. For generations, O'Toole leaders fought, negotiated, raided, formed alliances, and resisted attempts to reduce their independence. At different times, the family found itself in conflict with both neighboring powers and English authorities. Their story isn't one single rebellion. It's something longer. A centuries-long struggle to maintain influence while the political map around them kept changing. By the early modern period, that independence was increasingly impossible to preserve. But the name remained tied to the mountains where the family had once held power. 12. O'Rourke. Then there is O'Rourke. The O'Rourkes were rulers of West Breifne and one of the great dynasties of Gaelic Ireland. But the story of Brian O'Rourke shows just how dangerous opposition to the crown could become. During the reign of Elizabeth I, Brian resisted English interference in his territory. Eventually, he fled Ireland, but distance didn't save him. After reaching Scotland, he was handed over to English authorities and taken to London. In 1591, Brian O'Rourke was executed for treason. Think about what that meant to other Gaelic lords watching from Ireland. A ruler could leave his homeland, cross the sea, and still find the reach of the crown waiting for him. His death wasn't simply the end of one man's resistance. It was a warning. 13. Maguire. The Maguires of Fermanagh ruled another strategic Gaelic territory. And when conflict erupted in Ulster, their position placed them directly in the struggle. Hugh Maguire became one of the important early leaders of resistance during the 9 Years' War. Fermanagh's lakes and difficult terrain gave the Maguires natural defensive advantages, but geography could only protect them for so long. Maguire fought alongside the wider Gaelic alliance associated with O'Neill and O'Donnell. He was eventually killed in 1600. After the collapse of Gaelic resistance and the transformation of Ulster, the political dominance of families such as the Maguires was broken. Once again, a dynasty that had ruled territory for generations became a surname scattered among ordinary families. 14. O'Doherty. The O'Doherty story proves that even after the Great Gaelic defeat, rebellion wasn't finished. In 1608, Cahir O'Doherty launched an uprising in the northwest. For a brief moment, it shocked the authorities. His forces captured Derry. But the rebellion was short-lived. O'Doherty was killed, and the uprising collapsed. Its consequences reached far beyond one man. The destruction of O'Doherty power helped clear the way for even greater changes in Ulster. A family that had once controlled Inishowen lost the political position it had spent generations maintaining. The rebellion lasted only months. Its consequences lasted centuries. 15. O'Connor. Few surnames on this list can reach further back into Irish kingship than O'Connor. Different branches of the O'Connor dynasty ruled important territories, particularly in Connacht, and the family produced Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar, remembered as the last High King of Ireland before the Anglo-Norman invasion, fundamentally changed the island's political landscape. But the arrival of new powers did not instantly erase the O'Connors. Branches of the dynasty continued fighting, negotiating, dividing, and surviving for centuries. That longevity is what makes their story remarkable. Empires changed, borders changed, kings disappeared, yet the surname endured through all of it. When someone carries O'Connor today, they're carrying a name associated with a political world older than centuries of later British rule in Ireland. 16. O'Dempsey. The O'Dempseys were another important Gaelic family of the Irish Midlands, associated particularly with territories around what became Kings County. As English power expanded into the region, old Gaelic families faced increasing pressure. Some negotiated, some resisted, and some found themselves caught between rival powers in a landscape where yesterday's alliance could become tomorrow's disaster. The O'Dempsey story is important because it reminds us that the destruction of the old Gaelic order didn't happen in one battle. It happened gradually, through warfare, confiscation, political pressure, plantation, and generation after generation of families losing control over territory their ancestors had once dominated. But for our final surname, we return to Laois and to an episode remembered far more darkly. 17. O'Moore. The final surname is O'Moore, or Moore, as many descendants would eventually spell it. The O'Moores were the traditional rulers of Laois. But during the Tudor conquest, their territory became the site of one of England's earliest plantation experiments in Ireland. In the 16th century, Laois was renamed Queen's County, while neighboring Offaly became King's County. English settlers were introduced, old landholding structures were attacked, and the O'Moores repeatedly resisted. But the conflict didn't end quickly. For decades, members of the family continued fighting attempts to permanently remove their influence. Then came an event that would remain infamous in Irish historical memory. In 1577, members of the O'Moore family and other local leaders were invited to a meeting at Mullaghmast. What happened there became the subject of competing historical accounts in later tradition, but the gathering became remembered as the Massacre of Mullaghmast, in which numerous Gaelic leaders were killed. Whatever the exact details preserved through later retellings, the episode became a powerful symbol of betrayal during the plantation era. And that is why O'Moore closes this list, not because the surname itself disappeared, but because it didn't. After warfare, plantation, dispossession, migration, and centuries of political change, people still carry it. The rulers vanished, the old territories changed hands, but the family name survived. Outro. So there you have it, 17 Irish surnames connected across different centuries to kingship, rebellion, resistance, confiscation, exile, plantation, and the long struggle over who would control Ireland. And there's an important distinction. These surnames themselves weren't necessarily declared illegal simply because someone carried them. Their stories are powerful because particular chiefs, rebels, dynasties, and branches of these families repeatedly found themselves fighting or being treated as threats by the authorities trying to control Ireland. Some resisted until they lost everything. Some negotiated to survive. Some went into exile. And others watched political power their ancestors had held for centuries disappear within a generation. but their names survived. If your surname appeared anywhere in this video, comment the name below and tell us where your family is from. And even if your surname wasn't here, tell me which Irish family name you want investigated next. Subscribe to Surname Secrets, because in the next videos we're going even deeper into the forgotten stories hiding behind Irish family names. Because sometimes a surname isn't just a name, it's the last surviving piece of a world that disappeared centuries ago.